Is an anterior pelvic tilt really all that bad? Well, let's talk about what it is, why it matters, and how we can get the pelvis to move through all planes of motion freely. In this video, we'll talk about what an anterior pelvic tilt is and when it might become an area of concern. When we're looking at an anterior pelvic tilt, we're looking at the position of the pelvis in the sagittal plane. We're looking at the relativity of the ASIS, this pointy front bone here, and your PSIS, the dimples on the backside here. When you're in an anterior pelvic tilt, this ASIS is going to be forwards and down relative to the PSIS. When we're in a posterior pelvic tilt, the PSIS is going to be back and down relative to the ASIS. When your pelvis is in more of a neutral position, that ASIS and PSIS are in the same horizontal plane. Now, at rest, people will have about 7 to 13 degrees of an anterior pelvic tilt. This is going to help with having the natural lordotic curve that we have in our lumbar spine, and also means that this is the position that all attaching muscles are in this resting position with no tension. Now, when someone goes into an excessive anterior pelvic tilt, this can create extreme lordosis in this lumbar spine. It can also set up how all the attaching muscles in that pelvis are positioned to then function. That becomes an issue as well if someone has a hard time getting into the posterior pelvic tilt. We want all muscles and joints to be able to go through their full range of motion. This allows for full movement availability and allows us to better be able to maintain that neutral position when desired. Now, we also want to look at what happens during dynamic movement. So if we want the movement to occur in the spine, then let's let that pelvis go forwards and back in that anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. However, if we want the movement to, say, happen in the glutes instead, then we're looking to maintain a neutral pelvis position and a neutral spine as we then drive movements from the back side of that pelvis, opening and compressing here. If we're not getting that movement from the desired place, then we're going to load somewhere else instead. So it's all about restoring balanced movement in all movements and positions so that we can have healthy and happy muscles and joints. So come join me as we explore potential contributing factors to why a pelvis might be in an anterior pelvic tilt. The lats are a giant muscle that can provide stability to our spine and our pelvis. They insert on the front side of your shoulder and then come down and wrap around here like bat wings and invest into the thoracolumbar fascia. Now, when the lats are overly used or stiff, this can pull our pelvis into more of an anterior pelvic tilt. One great way to work on releasing those lats is doing a hang. We're also going to work on including a posterior pelvic tilt to get a full stretch through that entire backside of your body. So I'm going to hold on to something here that is nice and sturdy, and I'm going to have my feet about hip width apart, and then I'm just going to drop down. I'm feeling this upward rotation in my scapula, sitting down into my hips. I can even walk my feet forwards a little bit and then drag my heels back to tuck my pelvis under. Then I'm just going to hang out here and breathe, inhaling into my armpits, back, and hips, and then exhaling, feeling those lower abs pull me under a little more, or finding a little bit more hamstrings here. As you hold that position, you should just feel that nice stretch and lengthening through the entire backside of your body. It's also going to be a really great way to work on getting some length in paraspinals that can also be tight with being in more of that anterior pelvic tilt. Now, from a strengthening perspective, we maybe need to consider the balance in your upper body strengthening. Are you doing a lot of pulling exercises and not enough pushing? So maybe you need to include some more overhead pressing to help with balancing out all the pulling from those lats. We're making sure as we're pushing overhead that we're not flaring ribs and arching our back, because then that's just going to further contribute to tight paraspinals. We're also making sure when doing work like reverse flies or a serratus press and release that we're not pulling down and using those lats to compensate for maybe weaker scapular retractors or weaker serratus. So again, it's about getting that release work and then looking at how to bring balance to the system to make sure that those lats don't get overly dominant again and tight to pull that pelvis into more of that anterior pelvic tilt. As I mentioned, tight paraspinals can contribute to that anterior pelvic tilt. When those paraspinals are shortened on the backside, that's going to dump that pelvis forward, positioning the lower abs and the hamstrings in more of a lengthened position. So you might try to go to strengthen those other areas, but unless you eliminate the resistance on the backside, it's going to be a bit of a tug of war. So another great way to work on releasing those paraspinals is simply laying over a ball. You can use a small ball like this or a bigger exercise ball or even a bench, but the idea is that you're using gravity to help bring length and rounding through the area that's stuck in a little bit more extension. So you're going to lay here and you're just going to focus on positioning the ball so that the opposite side of your back is rounded. What I don't want is to keep that lower side flatter and excessively round up top. We're really trying to target the area that's a little bit stickier. Just by relaxing here, thinking about those sit bones dropping down through the backside of the knees and those knees getting a little bit heavier, that's going to help use gravity to help pull and lengthen and unstick this area. You can hold here and breathe, breathing into your back and sides and hips, and then exhaling and relaxing into it a little bit more, holding there for a few breaths. Now, sometimes we might need a little bit of release work of rolling on a foam roller, rolling on a ball before we go and do that, but really using gravity in that position can help that area unstick. Now, again, we need to consider why those paraspinals might be tight and overactive. It could be that they're overworking as a spinal stabilizer to make up for abs not showing up as much. It could be that maybe you're driving more of the movement from your spine versus the backside of your pelvis. And that can go for either thinking about lengthening into the backside of your glutes or coming out of the lengthened position and going into hip extension. Are you able to drive the movement from that pelvis extending, or do you have the tendency to extend in your back and flare your ribs as you go into that hip extension or stand up out of a squat or a hinge? But let's go ahead and continue to explore a little bit more about the role of the abs and the proximal hamstrings when it comes to the glutes and the back. So as I mentioned, with that pelvis being in more of an anterior pelvic tilt, the lower abs are in more of a lengthened position. So we've worked on decreasing the stiffness in the back, but now we need to work on shortening up and tightening the lower abs to pull you into a posterior pelvic tilt, giving those abs the other half of the range of motion that they're missing, so then you're better able to maintain neutral position. One of my favorite exercises for that is hands and knees breathing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to position shoulders over wrists and hips over knees. You can kind of let yourself wiggle out a little bit, roll forwards and side to side. Then what we're going to do is maintain hips right over knees and shoulders right over wrists. You're going to use your abs to think about that pubic bone pulling up toward your head and abs lifting back. That pelvis is going to rotate under like a wheel, lifting up through that stickier lumbar spine. Now, a lot of time what happens is people might get to about here and then they drive excessively from that mid-thoracic and upper abs. So really paying attention that you're getting that movement from your pelvis and from those lower abs to help target the desired area of movement. It might not be as dramatic in movement at first, but that's okay. You're working into it. So you're going to hold that position here, and then we're going to inhale into your back, sides, and hips, and then exhale from those lower abs, trying to pull and rotate under a little bit more. Hold that position again. Inhale, exhale, tuck and lift under a little bit more. So this is so great because it's positioning those paraspinals in a lengthened position, making it hard for them to contract and getting that length of those stiff back muscles while we're working on shortening and tightening up the abs on the front side. Now, one thing to look out for is as you go to exhale, if you lose that nice rounding and expansion, that's another instance where your back can be overworking and contribute to that back tightness. We're really looking for that slow grow with each breath to get a little bit more into that flexed position. We're also looking for a balanced ab engagement, making sure that it's not just bread loaf and superficial abs of tucking that pelvis under, but also thinking of those abs pulling back and compressing to get some transverse abdominals that help with pelvic and spinal stability. Now let's move on to looking at those hamstrings, because sometimes when we're looking at finding more of those lower abs, we might need to enlist some more hamstring help, whether in the moment or beforehand, to help make it easier for us to access our abs. So hamstrings are another muscle that get overly lengthened when that pelvis is in more of an anterior pelvic tilt. We then need to work on tightening up and shortening those hamstrings to pull that pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt to restore its full movement option in those hamstrings and again, restore that pelvis positioning. So what I really like doing for this is we can do a foot elevated bridge. By elevating your feet on something, you're going to bias to get a little bit more hamstrings to help with that reorientation of the pelvis. So we're going to lie down here and you're going to position your feet up on some yoga blocks or books. And we're going to pay attention to what is happening in that pelvis. So you're going to have your hips or hands on your hip bones and your pubic bones. And then we're going to lift up into that bridge. We're focusing on making sure that the fingertips stay higher than the hip bones. If my fingertips go lower, that then means that my pelvis has gone into an anterior pelvic tilt and I'm driving the movement from my spine instead of from my pelvis. So really thinking about dragging those heels back, thinking sit bones through backside of knees, knees over midfoot, pubic bone up towards head. So I'm this nice long flat line. I'm using my glute max and my hamstrings here to get into this hip extension. This is also going to serve as a great release for those hip flexors. And then you can just hold, okay? Then you're going to lower back down. You can also try this working hamstrings in isolation. That can have its own benefits of helping with pelvis movement. You can do it here with just finding those hamstrings and tucking that pelvis under a little bit without glutes or hip flexors. You could also position your legs up in a 90-90 position with feet up on a wall or a chair and work on finding proximal hamstrings there. But remember, we're thinking about using those hamstrings to pull that pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt to help with that other half of the range of motion that pelvis is maybe missing. Now let's explore why those hamstrings might be over lengthened to begin with. So sometimes when people are looking to sit back into their hips, as I've mentioned, they might have instead gone into an anterior or posterior pelvic tilt. When you go into an anterior pelvic tilt, you're going to lengthen through those hamstrings instead of opening up through the backside of that pelvis. So what we can do here is we can practice this concept in a rock back position. So I'm going to be here with hips over knees again and shoulders over wrists and a neutral spine. So again, you might have to kind of wiggle forwards and backwards to find that neutral. But then I'm going to focus on pushing my hands away without letting them go anywhere. Since they're not going anywhere, that's going to send my hips back. So as I'm going here, I'm paying attention that my pants line isn't changing, okay? If my pants line changes, then the movement is happening in my spine rather than from my sit bones widening and lengthening those glutes. So I'm going to press away as I sit back into those hips, feeling those sit bones widen. And then I can even push those feet back to help shift me back forward and work on the concept of hip extension. You can always put a yoga block on someone's back to help them monitor that it's not tipping one way or the other. They might need to squeeze a yoga block between their knees or push their knees out into a band without letting them actually go anywhere to help provide extra stability to get that length in the glutes. You can apply the same concept when you're going into a squat or a hinge and really just paying attention to where that movement is coming from and making sure it's from those glutes lengthening rather than the movement happening at the spine. The adductors are a large muscle group. They're on the inside of your leg, both on the front side here and on the back side. When they are tight and overactive, particularly the ones that also do hip flexion, this can pull your pelvis into more of an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at getting that adductor to eccentrically lengthen to let go. So you're look at putting load on it and helping it lengthen under that load to get it to let go and then passively bring it back in. If we want to think about, okay, what else is maybe not showing up enough that's making that adductor overwork, we're going to look at the abs and the glute med. The adductors, abs, and glute med all work together for pelvic stability. If one area isn't showing up as well, then somebody else is going to overwork. A great exercise to work on this is going to be hip hikes. We can focus on using that glute med to pull the pelvis down on the stance leg and raise the pelvis on the other side. Sometimes what can happen when people have overactive adductors is they might use the adductor on the other side excessively, or even the other side QL instead of the stance leg glute med. They might also end up overusing the stance leg adductor, which can then pull that femur into internal rotation. Both that internal rotation and being in more of an anterior pelvic tilt can contribute to hip impingement and unhappy hips. So we're really making sure that we're finding that glute med on that stance leg to pull that pelvis up and then controlling it to come down. All we're making sure that we're staying in that frontal plane and not flipping forwards and backwards in an anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. So with that in mind, we might need to work on finding some more proximal hamstrings or lower abs to help control the pelvis in the sagittal plane so it can work better in the frontal plane. Another great exercise to emphasize more glute med is doing a lateral lunge with some resistance where you're focusing on pushing away and abducting the leg to get you to go over onto the other side. That's going to help kick in some more glute med as well as positioning, lengthening those adductors. It's all about everybody showing up to help with the desired action. Short and tight hip flexors, particularly those that insert on the ASIS, can pull our pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, you can do some foam rolling and release work to get those hip flexors to let go. You can also work on finding some proximal hamstrings to reorient that pelvis and position those TFLs into more of a lengthened position, as well as going into hip extension to really lengthen them both at the hip joint and the knee joint. Now, we also need to consider why those TFLs, in particular, the tensor fascia lata, might be overworking. Sometimes they overwork as a pelvic stabilizer or overwork as an internal rotator. So we also need to look at what's happening with our glute med, our adductors, and our lower abs. The TFL will also become overactive when the psoas is no longer the primary hip flexor. So that psoas should be our big hip flexor. It should be the one that's particularly working above 90 degrees of hip flexion. Now, in order to get that 90 degrees, we might need to work on improving that pelvis positioning again, because if that pelvis is tipped forward into the anterior pelvic tilt, we try to bring that leg up and we're going to get some impingement there. So finding, again, those proximal hamstrings to reorient that pelvis, but then strengthening that hip flexion above that 90-degree range and even adding in some external rotation is going to help bias more psoas compared to that TFL. Then you're also making sure, as you work on the eccentric lengthening, that you're maintaining that neutral pelvis and stable spine while you're getting that length in the hip flexors versus everybody going with it and pulling your pelvis forward and your spine into more extension. The psoas can be a common one where we can know that it needs some strengthening, but maybe we need to set the stage and work on some other components first to help set it up for success when we go into doing the strengthening. When addressing an anterior pelvic tilt, there are a few key points to consider. First, we need to assess if it's something that's actually of concern and that needs to be addressed. Secondly, we need to think about restoring the pelvis's full range of motion in all planes of movement. Thirdly, we need to think about what are the driving factors that are maybe positioning that pelvis into more of an anterior pelvic tilt. This helps restore balance of movement and muscle actions throughout the hips and pelvis to help make for happy hips.